If you look at media coverage of climate change, you would conclude, based on the amount of time spent discussing it, that one of the biggest questions is whether or not we eat meat. A lot of people are highly resistant to that message, and that seemingly makes the advocates just that much more determined. How do we make sense of this? Well, let's have a look. Just a couple of weeks ago, the UK released its strategy for net zero by 2050, and it covered most of the different questions raised about how you would transition an advanced economy by the expert committee on climate change, except for one. It did not push for behaviour change by the population, either for eating meat or for flying. Indeed, even a discussion document by the so-called nudge unit about how to persuade people to change was pulled from publication almost as soon as it had gone live. This cuts across how a lot of the commentators tend to talk about climate change, where they historically ignored a lot of the big but boring questions about steel and about concrete, shipping and infrastructure, building, heating and all of that stuff. And they went straight to personal behaviours, and particularly what you choose to eat. The BBC has a particular tendency to go there. When interviewing the US climate lead John Kerry a few months ago, Andrew Marr listened to Kerry talking about how they were looking to transform the whole of their energy infrastructure, and yet he had no questions about some of the huge holes and dilemmas there, but instead he went straight here.
Isn't the brutal truth that at some point you're going to have to tell Americans to eat less meat?
The BBC's environmental correspondent Roger Harrabin has continually pushed this message in his reporting. In 2019, plant-based diet can fight climate change, says the UN. Well, the UN said a lot of things, but that was the one that Harrabin headlined. In June this year, ministers should urge public to eat less meat, reporting on the Committee of Climate Change Progress Report, again, which went far and wide, but that was the bit that he picked out. Then earlier just this week, tell people to fly less and eat meat or risk missing climate targets, Boris Johnson warned. Hilariously, I think he meant eat less meat, not eat meat. This was prompted by a response by the Committee on Climate Change, which was mostly welcoming the measures in the net zero strategy. But again, one specific part that Harrabin chose to focus on. I find this an intriguing contrast to the rest of the agenda. One of the big energy-consuming processes, for instance, is making steel. Barring the Extinction Rebellion types who don't really seem to understand the implications of some of the big demands that they make, nobody that I've seen is arguing that we should use less steel. They're asking, how can it be made without producing the emissions? One of the others is making concrete. Again, nobody's saying we should use less concrete. They're saying, how should we remove its impact? Nobody's saying that homes should be kept colder than a comfortable temperature. Rather, how they can be kept warm without the impact. Nobody's saying we should stop or reduce shipping, and so on and so on. But meat and flying, those are the two areas where keeping the benefit while reducing the impact doesn't seem to be considered for a moment by the majority of commentators on the issue. There are large numbers of people shaming others who eat meat and shaming others who fly. They have become moral questions above and beyond the practical question of how we reduce or remove an impact in the name of climate change. Now look, there are of course people who choose not to eat meat from personal moral convictions that eating animals is wrong. And that is a fine moral position for a personal choice. And to seek to persuade others to follow your lead. All of that, absolutely fine. In 100 years, look, we might well look back in distaste at the barbarism of our current diets. Maybe. I mean, don't count on it. But it's entirely possible that's how society will go. I'm not seeking to address those questions here. Only the ones that say these things are required to solve the emissions problem for climate change. Of course, some will say that it's precisely those people who have those moral beliefs who jumped onto climate change as a more powerful lever to push for the change that they wanted to see anyway. And that's certainly true for some. I don't think it's true for all. And yes, they have an incentive to exaggerate the arguments to fit their goals, or at least might be susceptible to motivated reasoning, as we all can be. On the other side, you have the financial interests embedded in the status quo, as well as the people who find comfort within existing cultural norms. They also have an incentive to push only the points that support their case, or can be lulled into the same sort of motivated reasoning. So as ever, we have to find our way between them by looking at the evidence for the claims that they make. But let's start with one piece of extremely challenging context for the anti-meat contingent. Worldwide meat consumption continues to rise. Whatever you might wish that the human race would embrace as its personal tastes and preferences in this regard, meat eating has been going relentlessly upwards. Over the last 50 years, meat production has tripled to around 340 tonnes, which signifies 80 billion animals slaughtered each year for food. As various countries, including the vast slice of humanity that is China, emerge from poverty, there is no naturally occurring trend right now suggesting any reverse to that recent history. Some of those that are most against meat are also the same as those who agonise about supposed affronts that they call cultural appropriation. But if we're taking culture into account, meat is a highly prized and desirable part of most food cultures. I would say all of them, where religion is not a constraining factor. Societies emerging from poverty particularly signal the journey by significantly increasing meat consumption. That's a reflection of the value that it offers, both in terms of nutrition and also in terms of status. So on nutrition, many researchers believe that it was the advent of meat eating, something like 2 million years ago, that enabled the brains of the ape known as Homo sapiens to grow to the size that it did. The high concentration of nutrition and energy, more easily absorbed by the gut, made it possible for system resources of the body to be diverted from that gut to fuel instead the energy-greedy brain. We know that in the modern age, of course, we can have a perfectly balanced and nutritious diet without meat, but it remains of high value with all the various nutrients that it provides. Secondly, on status, as we've discussed here several times, poverty was the norm for human societies. Indeed, it was universal up until the start of the Industrial Revolution, and really for quite some time after that. Meat was rarely available, save for those at the top, the royal courts and the barons, the elites. For everyone else, the diseases of malnutrition were a constant fact of life.
Please, sir, I want some more.
No wonder meat was held with special regard and became a high priority when things started to improve. The author Václav Smil noted that the link between greater meat consumption and economic modernisation holds up until the GDP of a country reaches about $10,000 per capita, at which point it starts to plateau. And no wonder indeed that the food cultures of the world will almost always have meat or seafood at the centre of their iconic and much loved dishes that are taken to define their national identity. From pot au feu for the French, spaghetti bolognese for the Italians, pho for the Vietnamese, Peking duck for the Chinese, roast lamb for the Aussies, paella for the Spanish, meatball for the Swedes, and ultimately beefy asado for the Argentinians, and so on and so on. And when people look at each other's food cultures, it tends to be the meat that attracts the interest. The recent globalization of food tastes has seen the spread of things like hamburgers and hot dogs, fried chicken and meat-topped pizza. A recent poll of Australian men found that nearly 3/4 of them would rather have a shorter lifespan than give up meat. So when you casually say that eating less meat or no meat should be part of your net zero world, that's what you're taking on. Now, if you were a pragmatist, wondering how you might find the route that works in bringing down the emissions of the world, it seems to me you would start by wondering if you could work with that status quo, not against it. I mean, wouldn't you? If you could find a route to net zero that went with the grain of how people are, wouldn't that be easier than thinking you could simply, rewire the entire human race? But the language of environmentalism has been developed over decades, and not by pragmatists in that regard, and it has shaped how we perceive these issues. When Prime Minister Boris Johnson launched the net zero strategy, he said there were no hair shirts in sight. And that was testament to how the movement and the agenda has come to be seen over long decades of campaign messaging. But okay, let's take that as context and not conclude for now whether it's a fact of life you have to accept or simply the size of the challenge because it must be changed. What are the arguments both sides are putting forward? The essence of the argument for the need to reduce meat from an environmental and not moral perspective is this. Claim 1. The climate and other environmental impact of meat is massively more than other foodstuffs, both from general food production and its role in driving deforestation. Claim 2. Significantly reducing or eliminating this impact would be a lot harder than getting people simply to change their diet, which can after all be just as nutritionally sound and enjoyable. Claim 3. Reducing meat will also free up lots of land that can be used more efficiently and productively. So it's not just impact, it's also efficiency. Now, those on the other side respond to claim 1 by saying that the impact is less than is claimed there, and you can end deforestation more effectively than changing the way the world eats. They respond to claim 2 by arguing that reducing or eliminating the impact is possible and is being worked on, that actually changing diets is hard and meat is nutritionally superior. And then they would add that with claim 3, the land question is also being overstated. Now, as far as I can see, from having witnessed the debate raging for decades, let's face it, neither side is especially motivated by how you pragmatically and most easily decarbonise the world. It's a passionate argument, but it's not passionate about finding a route that works for that goal. Most of those lined up against meat are indeed against meat at a moral level, either because they're ethical vegans or because they've been so long targeting animal agriculture for its environmental impact that it has become a moral matter. In the same way that for some anti-chemical campaigners, being anti-Monsanto has become a moral matter. Most of those lined up in support of meat are basically trying to defend the status quo that livelihoods are built on. They may be looking to decarbonise animal agriculture, but because it's the least worst option in surviving an attack on the industry. Ultimately, for me, this is why you need policymakers who are not in the trenches, who can step back and look at this. Because you could make a case for either. The question is which more easily achieves part of what is going to be an extremely difficult wider goal. And then there's that context question as well. This is a product that people want and enjoy, so shouldn't the default be not to deny them this option if you don't have to? That puts a higher burden of proof on the anti-meat side, since they have to show not only that meat-free would be optimal from a numbers game, but the alternative is significantly worse to the degree of not being supportable. That even if you fondly wish that everyone could eat what they wish, the weight of evidence forces you to conclude it's just not an option. Let's look at some of the state of the debate on some of those key points of contention. The well-promoted film Cowspiracy presented a number of stats about the environmental impacts of meat. 51% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to livestock and their byproducts, it said. Ruminants, particularly cows and sheep, produce methane, which is much more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. On water use, it said one hamburger equals 660 gallons of water. The meat and dairy industry, it said, used 1/3 of all the Earth's fresh water. It's hugely ineffective when it comes to land, not just with the large amount needed for grazing, but also the extra land that has to grow the feed for the livestock. It would be so much more efficient to grow food for people rather than grow food to feed animals to feed people. A plant-based diet cuts your carbon footprint by 50%, it said. And The Economist separately tweeted a few more stats, including this one. Red meat is about 35 times as damaging to the environment as a bowl of greens. Those are all stats that you could argue are sufficiently stark that they would support the anti-meat contention. So what does the other side say? Well, for one thing, they say the 51% of greenhouse gases from livestock figure is junk, a figure from a single non-peer-reviewed paper that campaigners have seized upon. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization puts the contribution from animal agriculture at 14.8% worldwide, which is still a significant contribution, but a long way short from that dramatic figure. And of course, if that figure is overstated, then you would expect the claim about how much reducing your consumption would reduce your own footprint would be likewise. Indeed, one study by White and Hall in 2017 estimated that if the whole of the United States, every single person, was to become vegan, it would save 2.6% of US emissions, which is more than it sounds, to be fair, but still a relatively modest contribution for what would be the biggest societal shift in history, arguably. They attack the water consumption figure as being highly misleading because it implies that all water needed to create a burger is used up, lost as in consumed. But 94% of that water is what's called green water, rainwater that falls on the fields to nourish the grass which is eaten by the cows. The vast majority of that water is returned into the local environment. It's part of a standard natural cycle and it isn't used up at all. Crops are far more often, they say, watered by irrigation from limited water resources than cows are fed by it. And that argument is pretty conclusive, to be honest, on the water side. More recent anti-meat statements and defences I've seen have tended to drop the water argument. As for the land use argument, the argument is that 2/3 of the land used by livestock is not suitable for growing crops, and the cattle eat material that is inedible to humans and would otherwise go to waste. Indeed, part of what they eat is the human inedible leftover material from human food production. And this is the flip side of them being ruminants. The way that ruminants digest food may create methane, but it does so in the heavy lifting required to digest matter that we would find indigestible. The meat defenders will also point out that methane, although a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, is a completely different equation because it only lasts in the atmosphere for a decade or two. And that means that if you have a stable number of cattle over a long period of time, the amount of methane will become balanced, degrading from the atmosphere at the same rate it's being added by the cattle. Totally different, therefore, to fossil fuel created CO2, which accumulates in the atmosphere over a very long time period. Plus, they say you shouldn't just deal in global averages. The US and the UK both produce beef much more efficiently than the world average. Emissions from US beef production are 10 to 50 times lower than in other parts of the world, and it produces around 18% of the world's beef with just 8% of the world's cattle. Likewise, emissions from UK beef production are already half that of the global average. Now, you can't just take the breeds and infrastructure and all the practices of the US or the UK and drop them fully functioning into Asia or South America. It has become a highly optimized process with a lot of infrastructure supporting it. So the most common US practice is to put the weaned cattle onto grass or feed them other roughage for 6 to 10 months until they reach about 300 kilograms weight. They're then moved to feedlots where they're fed intensively with highly calibrated feed to provide optimal nutrition for rapid growth until they get to their market weight over 500 kilograms. This gives them a process from birth to slaughter of between 50 to 56 weeks, compared to at least 145 weeks for animals raised solely by grazing, the norm in many other parts of the world. So to support those practices, you have to have the global industry of optimised feedstuffs, the feedlots, the optimised breeds, and so on. You can't just transplant it overnight. But there are clearly many improvements in efficiency that can be made elsewhere with existing technology. And both countries see plenty of potential for further improvement. The UK's National Farmers Union has set a target for net zero for the entire farming sector by 2040. It seems to me that if they believe that's possible, that should be something to look at seriously. I mean, they may be wrong, but why wouldn't you check? On the deforestation question, there's no disputing how much damage tropical deforestation does, both in terms of contribution to greenhouse gases as well as destruction to biodiversity. And no, while there's some balance in the planting of new forest elsewhere, and that's very important on a number of measures, mature rainforest is a different animal. It's not just about one new tree equals one old tree. But then the pro-meat defenders point out that there's no reason why deforestation has to result from meat production. Václav Smil noted this in his book about Should You Eat Meat? Brazilian cattle ranching causing large-scale destruction of natural vegetation Cerrado and parts of the Amazon's tropical rainforest, has been driven by tax and credit incentives, with the large landholders, and most of the business is in large and medium properties, actually less interested in raising cattle than securing their land tenure. Less destructively, Pampas of Argentina have produced beef for export since the late 19th century. All in all, there's some pretty substantive arguments amongst all of that. The anti-meat campaigners have some riposte to those points, of course. So, for instance, they'll point out that yes, maybe it's true that if meat herds are static in numbers, then the methane load would be climate neutral. But they point out that livestock numbers are not static. They are, as I mentioned earlier, continuing to climb, and that means that the methane load is growing strongly. And likewise, you have also to point to the opportunity cost, because if you reduce methane production rather than simply stabilise it, then because it degrades in the atmosphere, within 10 to 20 years, you will actually get a substantial reduction in greenhouse contribution. Unlike with CO2, which is much more stable. So where if you stop producing it and putting it into the atmosphere, it simply stabilises at the current level. Also, they say, although a number of the benefits that the advocates point to are achievable in theory, with well-managed, largely grass-fed cattle herds, in practice, that's not an accurate description of how the meat industry works. They also attack the White and Hall study, which said that all vegan United States would reduce emissions by 2.6%, arguing that it makes assumptions about continuing practices on the land that's used to grow animal feed, less than optimal than would be for their version, which would see that land fully turned over for producing fresh vegetable produce. The authors of the study did respond to that argument, pointing out that the market didn't necessarily encourage that switch because of the riskier profile of land in that geographical area used for growing vegetables. Climatic factors there lead to high levels of waste in vegetable growing. Now there comes a point where the margins of what they're arguing about seem to be getting relatively small in relation to the bigger questions. So what do we make of all of this? You can go endlessly into the detail of the back and forth between the two sides, and it's easy to get diverted by the minutiae. Here's my take. First of all, the animal production industry has a bunch of other problems it has to solve, which we haven't even touched on here. If meat is to remain a sustainable part of the diet of the human race, it needs to sort out issues with overuse of antibiotics, with overuse of nitrogen fertilizers on animal feed crops, leading to pollution of watercourses, and also the economically unnecessary animal cruelty that still takes place, which could be fixed. Those are achievable, they are being worked on, but there's a lot of work to do. There's an argument that I've not often heard made in defence of meat, which is that it's part of a diverse range of sources of nutrition. It's possible to rear animals in some circumstances where crops could be vulnerable. And when you're trying to make your food system as resilient as possible, you might not want to narrow the diversity of your food sources, especially to remove sources of high nutrition in favour of ones of more limited nutrition. But ultimately, when I look at this, I don't get much beyond that short-term inevitability question that we started off with. The majority of the human race currently wants meat in all its diversity. Have the would-be technocrats of a net zero world, and I say that as someone who supports net zero as a goal, remember, have they really done everything they could to ensure that people can have what they want? Because that's not what we see. What we see from the BBC and from the environmental campaigners and from some of the scientists who align with those values is that they have been promoting the moralistic prohibition of meat eating for decades. This is not their last option, it's their first preference. And the influence of their campaigns has had some impact locally. I mean, the UK, for instance, has seen a reduction in meat eating of 18% over recent decades. But that's probably at the limit of where that process alone is going to drive it. If people want meat, you've not proven the capacity to persuade them otherwise. And it's probably time you started trying to answer a different question. Now, that's not to say that some reduction isn't desirable. There's no doubt that red meat particularly is indeed a high-impact nutrition source. But it's not a change that's going to come about by large numbers of people voluntarily giving up meat, especially via a process of activists haranguing and bullying and or taxing them into cutting down. Research suggests that even those who fervently want to be vegan or vegetarian mostly end up failing in their attempted personal transformation within the first year. Around 84% of them, according to a survey of Americans. That should tell you everything you need to know, really. The UK Committee on Climate Change said that we need to reduce red meat consumption by 30% over the next couple of decades, a change which is of a sort of magnitude that could be done relatively quietly and without government diktat. For instance, since the 1970s, the number of ready-made meals eaten has risen by 5 times. It would be extremely easy for the big corporations to standardise on a gently evolved meat-veg blended product that wouldn't be seen as much of a problem or maybe even noticed by their customers. Retailers like Tesco are forecasting that using their marketing and product development muscles, they will be able to increase the number of wholly meat-free meals consumed by 300% by 2025, selling products that are attractive to consumers. I know, radical stuff. And the thing that nobody much mentions is that although worldwide we're seeing significant advances of countries out of poverty, we're also seeing demographic shifts that ultimately will start to kick in, pushing the other way. The combination of the ageing population, health concerns, reductions of growth expectations in relatively static populations will probably begin to introduce a declining per capita meat consumption in many countries. In the same way that we're seeing levelling off and slow decline in many places of population growth. It's going to be a while before meat consumption peaks, but it will certainly do so over the next coming decade or two. But that's a pragmatic observation. What are the trends? What's likely to happen? What can be improved? What you probably have to accept? That's not the tenor of the debate that's currently going on about meat and climate change, which is a values debate masquerading as a scientific one. Ultimately, when something such as cutting meat from the diets is clearly so countercultural and difficult, thinking you should make it your headline focus, your option of first choice, is probably a mistake. Now, if you're interested in this area of climate policy and food, I recently did a video looking at what seems to be a massive policy misstep by the EU, pushing for a quarter of all its agricultural land to be organic. Again, do the facts support the proposal? You might want to watch that one next.